I want to tell you a story. It's about a guy named Peter. He's a financial advisor who really enjoys helping others. Sometimes it gets him in trouble. One day, Peter was looking to grow his business. He decided to hire a new employee, so he posted a job opening. The next morning, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, the door opened up just like this, and in walked 4 job applicants. A couple brunettes and a couple of redheads. Next up in line, there were 4 guys in a row. Peter interviewed them all, but he got a little confused because they were all named Jack. Peter saw a long line forming. He had a lot of interviews to go through. He actually interviewed many people, but he could only hire 1. When he was finished, he wanted to help the rest of them, so he did something pretty unusual. He actually opened up his own personal network and started making calls to figure out if he could find job leads for these applicants that he just met. It took him pretty much all day. By the time he was done, it was late in the afternoon. He looked at his watch, and it was about 4:57. Peter has a history of putting other people's interests ahead of his own. It started when he first got into the industry, which was back in '88. It continued when he became a financial advisor 4 years later, in '92. And at that point, he had a little experience, but he was still pretty young. He was just 22. Peter, one afternoon, got a call. It was a colleague named Brad calling, asking for a favor. And Peter looked at his watch. It was still pretty late in the afternoon that day. It was about 4:57. Brad said, "I'm in a pinch. Would you be willing to help me? I'm trying to get out of the industry, and to do that, I need somebody to buy my clients so I can actually afford to leave." Peter agreed on the spot, even though there were just 2 days' notice, and he bought Brad's clients. A couple months went by and something strange started to happen. Peter's clients began disappearing. First 1 left, then a second, then a third. Peter noticed a pattern. They were all former clients of Brad's. He did a little detective work, and he found out that Brad was being a little bit of a devil. He was back in the business, but he had never told Peter. He was calling up his old clients and saying, "Hey, why don't you come back over and work with me?" without paying Peter a dime for them. That whole thing cost Peter about $10,000. But that didn't stop him from helping others. One day, Peter got a call from a client who worked in the scrap metal business. And the client was looking for some help. He said, "Will you come out and see me? I want to make some changes to my retirement plan." Peter's colleague said, "Don't do it. It's a tiny client. It's not even worth the amount of time it'll take to drive to his house." But Peter wanted to help, so he looked up the address, and the client lived at 3688 West 9th Street. He drove out to see the client, and when he pulled up to the driveway, his jaw dropped. The front door was covered in cobwebs. When he walked inside with the client, it was disgusting. There were bugs everywhere, there was no furniture, and the whole ceiling had been ripped out. You could see right through up to the sky. Peter sat down to talk to the client, and he said, "You seem like a pretty young guy. What are you, about 32? The client said, "You're close. I'm 33. They spent a couple hours together, and Peter was helping him as much as he could. Got pretty late. Peter looked at his watch again, and he said, "Wow, it's 4:57. The client said, "Hey Peter, before you go, I want to show you something in my shed." So he walks Peter around to a dingy looking shed, and Peter braces himself for another depressing display of poverty. But when the client opens up the shed, Peter's shocked. There's a dream collection of cars. There's a first generation Camaro, there are a couple of vintage drag racers. Turns out, the client is not a scrap metal worker, he owns a lucrative scrap metal business. The house is a fixer-upper, the client paid over $1 million for it, and it's on 11 acres. The client was so grateful for Peter's willingness to help that the next year, he increased his fees, first multiplying them by a factor of 10, and then by a factor of 10 again. A couple days later, Peter's getting ready to leave work. It's late in the afternoon. It's actually about 4:57. He goes to a party, and who does he run into there but his old colleague Brad, who had taken his clients without paying him. He said, "Brad, how's it going?" And Brad said, "Actually not so good. I had 18 employees working for me, and one day, 9 of them quit, followed by the other 9. Brad said, "How are you doing?" Peter was actually doing quite well. He'd been promoted. He was now the managing director of his firm, and he had very low turnover. When his staff rated him, he had off-the-charts engagement. His staff gave him a pair of perfect 10s. Profits were skyrocketing. The firm was bringing in over 7 figures, and Peter's staff made out like kings. In the short run, Peter's generosity left him empty-handed. But in the long run, it's given him a handful of aces. I've written a book, Give and Take, about the magic and the science behind success. Is it better to be a giver, like Peter? A taker, like Brad? Or, like most of us, fall somewhere in between? To answer this question, I've compiled surprising studies and stories, including how one of America's best networkers developed his connections, why a creative genius behind one of the most popular TV shows in history was unknown to the world for years, how a basketball executive responsible for multiple draft busts turned things around and made his team a winner, and how we could have anticipated the demise of Enron 4 years before the company collapsed, all without ever looking at a single number.